Oh, good afternoon. I'm Nick Gostick, so I'm head of IP commercialisation and incubation at Loughborough University. Very quickly, a bit of my background. My original PhD was in environmental biotechnology from Cranfield University, and I spent most of my career working at that interface between universities and business at universities including Sheffield, Warwick, Birmingham, Keele, um, and maybe a step out from university. So for those of you that know Nottingham, I was part of the team that did BioCity in Nottingham and the Nottingham Clean Tech Centre, which were incubators to support high growth businesses in sort of knowledge based sectors. So I've got a few slides which hopefully I can share without too much problem. And if I make that. Okay. Okay, is that presenting properly?
We can see that, Nick. Thank you. Yeah.
Fantastic. Good. Of course, I can now not see anybody. But
Nick, we've actually got your presenter screen showing, not the slides.
Oh, right. Okay. That's not how it should be working. Let me try again.
Always picking the right display, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, I thought I did it right last time, but let's try it this way.
Much better.
That's the one. Perfect.
Right. Okay. It's not the way it usually works, but these things are sent to try us. Okay, I think the first thing I wanted to comment was that Loughborough University is a research-led university with significant strengths in engineering, in design, a range of science subjects, and of course we're known globally for our sport and sport research. As a university, we have a firm commitment to generating impact, and that means that our research has purpose. It impacts in the real world. But I think it's also unfair to comment that innovation doesn't spring fully formed from research at the university. And a lot of the research at the university, whether it's curiosity driven, that's just investigating some aspect of science or the knowledge base, practical, where research is driven towards a specific problem. For example, that might be a disease or a technology issue, or is translational, where there is a potential solution which is being researched and developed within the university. There's still a gap to that becoming an innovation and being practically applied outside of the university. And a lot of work the university does is about what we call knowledge exchange, bringing together our researchers, the problems or opportunities, and the customer in various ways. But today I'm just going to focus on technology transfer, which is specifically looking at the commercial tools of spin-outs and licensing. So just to reiterate, there's a whole range of ways in which the university tries to affect knowledge exchange through interacting with particularly the business community through training, dissemination events, the co-development, collaborative research. But as I said, I'm looking at licensing and spin-outs. So when I'm talking about licensing and spin-outs, this is really the two commercial tools that we frequently use. Licensing is where we license or contractually give the right to use a technology to a third party, and that could be public sector, could be an SME, or it could be a large corporate, and they have the right to use that technology, and generally they would pay us, the university, a small royalty based on the commercial performance of that technology. A spin-out company is similar, except we license the technology to a company which the university creates and participates in as a shareholder. I could spend a whole hour talking on why you would choose to license a technology or spin out a technology, but in very broad terms, we license technology when it's a incremental improvement in a technology, and so might be of interest to a company or organization that's already well established, and this is a small improvement to the technology. So typically we would license an improvement to a large corporate that already has quite an established market and can get to the market quite quickly. We'd use a spin out, for example, where we have a more disruptive technology where there isn't an obvious company to license the technology to, particularly where the technology needs quite a bit more work and we need a vehicle that can raise investment and high risk investment like venture capital to invest in that opportunity. So just going back a step, this is essentially what my team at the university does. We start by working with our academic colleagues to try and identify commercial opportunities emanating from their research. It might be obvious because they've had a grant to research a particular problem, or it might be less obvious. It might be that we get into conversation with an academic and they say, this is my research, what could I use it for? And that requires a bit of creative thinking to think, well, actually, here's a problem in industry that this technology might be applicable to. The first formal step is what we call disclosure, which is where an academic says to us, the university, I have an idea which I think might be commercially interesting. We are the employer, so we own the intellectual property that comes out of research, and that disclosure is the formal process of our academics, our employees telling us this is an idea that I have. And that's important because we have quite a generous incentivization mechanism to encourage academics to be creative, to be entrepreneurial, and come up with ideas. Essentially, if we license a technology and we make any money out of that license, at least half goes back to our academic colleagues, which they get through payroll, but that benefit actually follows them through their career, and even when they leave the university, they're still paid that benefit. If we create a spin-out company, then typically the university would retain between 10 and 25% of the business as equity, and the rest would be available to the academic founders and founding team of the company. The first thing we do when we've got an idea is we then have to assess it. We ask a number of simple questions. The first is anybody interested? Might anybody pay us money for that idea? Does it actually solve a problem people are prepared to spend money to solve? And it might seem obvious, but often, and this is true in any business, it's very easy to get caught up in the idea and forget to ask the customers whether they really want it. And it's better to know that sooner rather than later. My team will then assess whether the intellectual property is protectable. Can we patent it? Is there a commercial strategy that can get us to the marketplace? And then we work with our academic colleagues and bring in third parties to implement that commercial strategy. So what are the big challenges? The first is just validating that the innovation is a good solution for the problem. I said it sounds easy, but in practice, most businesses fail because they can't sell their stuff, because nobody wants it. The price is wrong, or the technology is not right, or it doesn't fit into the supply chain. So those conversations with customers and business are incredibly important. And I've just marked out some of the schemes we use. iCure from Innovate UK is a fantastic program where the government will pay for one of our early career academics to basically get out of the university for 3 months, travel the world, and speak to at least 100 potential customers and ask them about their problems to find out whether the technology is useful or not. Ventureversity is a program that we ran in Leicestershire, but we've got funding to extend it across the Midlands. And Ventureversity is where we do that on a similar but more local, where we engage with local businesses and our graduates, really to build more of a team around the technology to see if we can find a commercial strategy. And announced just recently is Forging Ahead and Forging Beyond, which is a Research England funded program, Midlands wide, but led out of Loughborough. It's a 10 million program to improve the environment for spin-out companies. So we will be engaging with professional services, with potential people that come and work in our companies, looking at skills that might be required, and also looking at what we can do to support priority sectors across the Midlands. The second challenge is funding the commercial development of an opportunity, and that is working to get grants, loans, but a lot of what my team spend doing is chasing investment from business angels or venture capital. And I have to say that in the Midlands, particularly for spin-outs, but more generally, the amount of venture capital that we raise for early stage knowledge-based businesses is lower than the rest of the country. And there's a number of reasons for that, but the Midlands universities, we're fed up of waiting for something to change, so we have got our own initiative called Midlands Mindforge, which is a company which has been set up by 8 of the Midlands universities. In our region, it's Leicester, Nottingham, and ourselves, Loughborough. And we are in the process of raising a 200 million investment fund to invest in mostly spin-out companies, but also other associated high-growth knowledge-based businesses. I thought I could finish with just a couple of quick examples of what we do. So we had a technology, high-speed sintering, which is a 3D printing technology, which was developed at Loughborough University. We have licensed that to a German company, and that has been quite well used and delivered a return for us, the university, and the inventing academics. And second, one of our spin-out companies, we have about 19 active spin-outs from Loughborough University at the moment. Zaindu Limited spun out from the university in 2019. This was a treatment developed initially to sterilize contact lenses, but through the iCure program, which I mentioned earlier, an early career researcher went out and spoke to customers and discovered that actually the contact lens industry wasn't particularly interested, but it had a fantastic application as a seed treatment to increase the speed of germination, plant health, and yield. and Zaindu Limited is based at the Loughborough Science Park, and is going great guns developing this technology into the marketplace. And if I stop sharing.
Thank you very much for that, Nick. I thought it was really interesting. I particularly like the fact that you go out for one thing with a development with regards to contact lenses, and it ends up being a thing that works for plant growth. That's quite amazing, really. Right, if I could just introduce Scott now. Scott Knowles, the Chief Executive of the East Midlands Chamber, who's our second speaker.
Thank you, Nick. Really interesting. Thank you, Sean. So, for those of you that don't know much about the Chamber, in a nutshell, we are a representation, a business support, and a membership organisation, and we work with about 12,000 businesses each year. And that's everything from pre-start, so those entrepreneurs that want to become self-employed. Sometimes they don't know what they want to do other than being self-employed. So we help with that spirit of enterprise. And then we work with sole traders, micro businesses, SMEs, which are the vast volume of the businesses we work with, and then those large global brands that we seem to have so many of. So I'm just going to share my slides, Sean, if I may. And hopefully everyone can see that. As Nick said, I can't see anything at this point.
That's fine. That's fine, Scott. That's good.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sean. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and in about 4 or 5 slides just share the current economic conditions, because of course that does have an impact on innovation and the prospects of innovation. So so this data is really current. So this was only put to bed at the end of last week. And the data that you're going to see does 2 things. So it measures performance in the quarter just gone, and then it measures confidence or sentiment in the quarter that we're now in. And all of this data is post Trump tariffs, and of course following the Chancellor's budget in autumn last year. So just in terms of sample size, there's 354 responses. And they're broadly split between manufacturers and then service sector businesses. So this and the next slide are the really important ones. So what you can see on here is the really important column is the right-hand one, which shows the direction of change. So that's the difference between the previous quarter and this quarter that we're now in. Now, on the surface of it, that looks really positive because you've got far more green than red. So green is good, red bad. And what you can see here is all the different metrics that this survey takes into account. As I said, it looks at performance in the quarter just gone. So, for example, UK sales, and then measures confidence in the quarter we're now in. For example, what do order books look like, both at home and overseas for those exporters, but it also measures recruitment intentions and investment intentions. So on the surface of it, it sort of looks really positive. However, this is what we call our State of the Economy Index. This effectively mashes together all of the metrics from across the whole survey into a single graph. Now, this data goes all the way back to 2013. So the really, really deep trough was the onset of the pandemic in 2020. So what you can see there is quite a bit of a fall off a cliff at the end of 2024. So following the announcement by the Chancellor of an increased cost of business with effect from April this year. So, for example, national insurance contributions, increase in the minimum wage. So you can see that it dropped off a cliff. It kind of got halfway to sort of where we were prior to the start of the pandemic. Then it's plateaued, and actually positively it's gone back up. Now, obviously what we want to see in subsequent quarters is that continued trajectory north in that sort of deep V type arrangement. So what are businesses saying are their greatest concerns? So again, probably no surprises here really. The impact of inflation and things like competition, so all linked to price rises. Are businesses absorbing cost, or are they passing it on? And it feels like a lot of businesses have absorbed as much as they can before they pass it on. So corporate taxation, again, no surprise there. Business rates is a perennial feature in the things that are of a great concern to business. So our argument as a chamber is that the business rate system is completely broken. It's a bit of an 18th century model that's been trying to apply it to the 21st century. So very basically, if you are a traditional type business and you need a large footprint, such as traditional manufacturing, you're penalized. You might be a digital business in a really tiny room. Your profits might be enormous, but actually you're exempt from business rates purely because you don't need a large physical footprint. So access to skilled labour. If you went back and looked at this at our quarter economic survey 30 years ago, it's still about skills gaps. It was still about getting the right level and the right volume of resources. So nothing's changed there. And then things like interest rates and exchange rates, particularly for those that buy things like raw materials in dollars. So, and therefore, you've got a bit of a mixed economic landscape, although it clearly feels better this quarter than it did for the previous 2 quarters as government policy started to flow. So I'll not dwell on that, and I'm sure Sean will be sharing these with you afterwards. So that's really the landscape in which businesses are operating, and therefore, what does that mean from an approach to innovation? So this is what we find. Working with those 12,000 businesses, the chamber has about 60 business advisors at the moment. That's everything from generalists through to high growth specialists to international trade specialists, access to finance, and so on. My experience would be when I ask businesses about innovation, they don't actually realize they're actually being innovative. From their perspective, it's, well, that's just what we do, isn't it? But actually what they're doing might be innovative. And of course, there are things there like the R&D tax credit system. And whilst that feels like it's far more, it's got a lot more rigor around it than perhaps it used to have in many years ago. Businesses clearly could be looking at quite a significant reimbursement through that scheme. But so my experience is a lot of businesses that are innovating don't actually necessarily class it as such. Obviously, you've seen there from the previous slides, there are some real cost pressures. We call it a crisis in the cost of doing business. That there's a commercial reality at heart there. We are hearing more from businesses that are seeking to reduce their headcount. Some of it as a result of innovation, so the adoption of AI solutions, for example. But definitely, some businesses are putting off what could be considered innovative expenditure in their business, whether that's buying 3D printing technology, whether it's about looking at a next generation CNC machine and so on. And whilst investment is still happening, it feels like it takes a lot longer than perhaps it used to. More decisions, more protracted thinking, and so on. Obviously, that's then having that impact, as I said, in terms of ultimate headcount within SMEs. And of course, you've also then got, it feels like perhaps up until this year, ESG almost became a new darling word for business, particularly for SMEs, environmental, social, and governance. And I think what I always think is quite interesting around that is the E is arguably the easy bit, and lots of businesses focus on the E in ESG. One, because it's the right thing to do, but also clearly there are cost reductions. There's a competitive element in there as well. Some focus on the social, not many focus on the G bit. But I think it's all about that rounded sort of approach to business strategy and where innovation sits in there. And of course, with the SME, the fewer resources within an SME, actually an awful lot of this then sits on the shoulders of the MD, or the major shareholder, the chief executive, or the owner of the business. So just to finish, and I won't go through these in detail, I think these are more for you to have a good look at afterwards. One of the things that the Chamber does, it works with Innovate UK, and I thought you'd just probably enjoy seeing a few case studies in terms of some of those innovative businesses across the region, and actually what the outcome of them being innovative is. And obviously these are all really positive, high growth stories, where businesses have taken an innovative approach, sought out support. And I think one of the things I would say, all the research indicates that those businesses that seek out business support, they grow quicker, they thrive, they survive, rather than those businesses that for some reason have always eschewed business support. So we've got one here called Seamless Source. We've got Halo Solutions, which if you look at them online, is really, really clever stuff, and actually they've grown enormously. Really maximise things like the benefit of the King's Award for Enterprise, which a lot of innovative businesses seek. One, to give them validation about the high quality of what they are, but equally, it's a brilliant award from a marketing strategy perspective. And then we have one more recently, Blind Screen, and again, quite a local business there, doing some really, really clever stuff. But I'll let people, Sean, sort of have a go through some of those, and I'm sure some of those are familiar to Nick as well. So I think that was my last slide. It was. I will stop sharing. There we go. You can see everyone again.
Thanks very much for that, Scott. It's really interesting. It's interesting, isn't it, how the as you were pointing out, the skills thing, the access to skilled people, it's a perennial. It might move up and down that sort of top 5, but it's always in there somewhere, and it's obviously what we're trying to address with the IoT. Did anybody have any particular questions they wanted to put to either Scott or Nick at this point? Just as an informal Q&A at the end, if there's anything people wanted to flesh out or address. Rachel.
I'm happy to throw one in as a starter in case other people have some questions that they'd like to ask. But I suppose the one that's for me, and I was actually going to put the British Business Bank have a really good link and explanation around ESG. I was going to pop that into the chat, but I don't appear to have access to it. So might want to check on the settings for the meeting, Sean, that everyone's got access to the chat if they've got questions. I suppose the question from me was, we've sort of had that overview of the state of the economy recently and some of the challenges that businesses are facing, but also how universities in particular are responding to bringing forward innovation. If innovation is happening within a company or a small company in particular, and they want support to commercialise that, what are the kind of really basic steps that company would need to take, or that individual, if they want to do it on their own, take forward to bring that new innovative product or service to market? And is there, what kind of support could they look to access, either from the universities in region or from the Chamber or other support agencies? I suppose that's to both of you.
I'll jump in if you like, Rachel, to start. So I think one of the challenges here is about that fragmented approach to business support. It is very postcode lottery driven at the moment, and really has been since the sort of demise of European funding a few years ago. It doesn't mean that there's not support there. There's quite a lot of it. but there is very much a dependence on where the business is located. I think that will only endure for this year. I think there is an opportunity for having a much more consistent regional approach from the 1st of April next year. I'd always encourage any business who to talk to an R&D tax specialist, which may or may not be their accountant. One of the bits of feedback we get sometimes from those where we might think they're being very innovative, particularly around R&D, particularly if it's a very generalist firm of accountants, and that's not a criticism. You know, most small businesses start with a very small firm of accountants. They stick with that firm of accountants. You know, it's a bit like changing your bank. You don't do it on a whim. But actually, are they then getting the best advice rather than sort of engaging with an R&D tax specialist? And I think that bit around, and then I think it's around things like access to finance or access to support. It's a hand-holding exercise that a lot of, particularly SMEs, need to sort of help them navigate it, because it's not that straightforward. You know, I'm sure Nick will concur. University colleagues, you know, when I talk about the region, I'm talking about 3 cities and 3 counties, and there's 6 world-class universities there. But it is also about engaging with academia. There's a huge amount of business support available from universities as well as from the chamber and elsewhere. But someone needs to help you hold your hand through the process, because it does take a bit of challenge to navigate it. But there is a lot of support there, and even if initially computer says no, there are other ways around it as well, because of course it's not just about what's immediately available locally. There might be some sectoral stuff which might be on a regional basis, or it might even be national or international, depending on what it is that the business is doing. So yeah, that's why I thought it was worth saying, you know, we still come into contact with lots of businesses that for some reason have not taken up any form of business support, whether it's from the chamber, whether it's from universities. And of course, we'd always encourage that businesses take advantage of all the stuff that's available.
Kate had a question, I believe.
I was just going to ask, do you think it's regional? Do you think it's a particular kind of Midland expanse problem about lack, you know, don't accept the help or don't kind of go and look for the support that is available, or do you think it's across the UK?
I mean, my answer, Kate, would be I think it is a countrywide thing. If I talk to other chambers elsewhere, they will say, you know, when they're delivering business support, you get great take up from those that have always accessed business support, and a harder conversion for those that for some reason have not traditionally taken up business support. So I don't think it's restricted for us. Okay,
interesting. Thank you.
I just had an observation rather than a question, really, in just something Nick said, which, being from an arts background rather than a technical background, I found quite interesting, was the point you made about most spin-out companies are making a sort of relatively modest improvement to an existing technology, rather than, I suppose, people like myself have this kind of view of people in laboratories having eureka moments and oh my god, this will change the world sort of thing. So I thought that was just quite interesting. So it's kind of at odds with you think of, as I say, with somebody like myself who doesn't come from a technical background.
I'd just perhaps comment that yeah, the eureka moments, you know, take a lot of hard work. And when we talk about spin outs, you can use a rough metric that universities generate about 1 spin out for every 50 million of research that they do. That doesn't mean that a spin out costs 50 million, because the research is done for many other reasons. But in terms of having something that is commercially interesting enough to generate a spin out company, that's a fairly consistent metric across the university sector, really.
Martin, you had our chair Martin had a question, I believe.
Yeah, which was really a comment, really, just to pick up on some that both of the speakers have alluded to. I think Scott's right. Businesses who take up advice and support are the ones that are most successful. I know from a qualification I did a few years ago, that to answer Kate's question, I think that's down as low as only 39% businesses ever ask for outside help, because it's their baby, they started it. How can anybody else tell me what to do? But reflect on my own experience. Starting out my experience working with the university, started with Nottingham University, and it's almost like knowledge transfer by osmosis. So just being around people, you start to pick up that knowledge and you increase your own knowledge. And that, for us, that eventually ended up with us doing a knowledge transfer partnership with Nottingham University. So I would encourage any business to really start to look at what support they can get locally, because as Scott says, there's a huge amount of support.
Oh, Rachel again, you had a question, I think.
It was again something a bit wider, and the example that you gave, Nick, about the different application of that activated air model it got me thinking. We've had some conversations with a company that applies graphene 3D printing technologies, and they've been working with students to look at potentially new applications for graphene that they hadn't even thought of. And actually the students at relatively, actually quite young ages, were identifying potential opportunities for the reapplication or reuse of existing products or services in new settings. And actually a couple of those have been identified as quite commercially viable. And I just wondered if either of you had any reflections on whether we maybe could be utilising the kind of Institute of Technology community a bit better to think about some of these applications of products, services or materials in a way that we don't necessarily haven't already thought of. And because it struck me as a great opportunity, both for learners and for companies to really think through how they might get that kind of reach. Welcome your reflections from either of you on that.
So I commented on the programme that we ran with Leicester and De Montfort universities, Ventureversity, which was essentially to reach out with technologies, and I called them suboptimal, but not in a pejorative way. What I meant was that they're ideas and technologies that don't fit the classic model, but still I'm convinced have benefit if only we can manage to find exactly the right opportunity for them. Because a lot of technology, you have all sorts of different applications in the marketplace, and actually getting a commercial strategy that finds a way into the marketplace is quite a skill or quite an art. But actually what it does require is quite a lot of conversations with the marketplace, with businesses, to understand what their problems and issues and challenges are. Because unless you've worked in business, you perhaps don't recognize that what the problem is, because supply chains are complicated, businesses are complicated, technologies are complicated, and the way that many businesses generate revenue is complicated. It's not just as simple as make stuff, sell stuff, make a margin. Modern business relationships are very complicated, and the technology has to fit into that. We constantly find that the actual application of the technology is perhaps not where you expected it. I remember one from Birmingham. A technology, we went out into the marketplace confident that we had a new safety technology, and came back with a tremendous amount of interest and support for what turned out to be a technology that would allow companies to schedule maintenance. Turns out that would save them a lot of money. But as for safety, the route to getting a new safety procedure into that industry was long and expensive, and was completely unlikely for a small business. So actually, that when you get those conversations going, they're really interesting as to how you can apply technology and what particularly end users and customers will eventually do with that technology.
Interesting.
Did anybody else get involved in that? Sorry, Scott, have you got a view?
I'll just give you an example. It's that complexity, I think, that Nick talks about, and how much bandwidth that takes up for the SME business owner. We had an example at the end of last week for a Midlands-based manufacturer. They import raw materials both from Europe and from China. They assemble it into a final product and they export it to the USA. And the question was, what tariffs apply? And nobody knew the answer. We didn't know the answer. The customer in the USA didn't know the answer. And, you know, just that one thing, which would have quite a substantive impact on, you know, I think they ended up selling it at the same price as always because nobody could work it out, and we'll just have to work it out later. So they either arguably undersold the product or oversold the product. But so that's just one example, and they're quite, you know, they're a growing international business with a presence in a dozen markets, adding new markets every 6 months or so. Arguably, it's a monopoly type product. So in many ways, the end user, in this case, the American marketplace, well, they're just going to have to pay the tariff because nobody else makes one of these things. So, but just that complexity. So if you're the owner of an SME, or you're the major shareholder, the CEO, the MD, you're thinking about innovation, but you've also got all of this other stuff that at the moment is just absorbing all of your bandwidth, and you sort of have to get it right because it has a real impact on ultimately the success of the business.
Yeah, if I go back to my experience of when I had my first business, which I ran myself, which I ran for 5 years, rather embarrassingly, I didn't seek any support, business support, largely because I didn't know it existed. I stumbled into a business after doing my PhD because I worked for a company and I thought, this is ridiculous, I can do a better job than this, so I did, and set my own business up. So I had no business training, business background. Hopefully our graduates emerge with rather more business acumen. We train at least 1,000 of them every year in some elements of enterprise, and a lot of them go on to set up their own graduate businesses, which we support through the university alongside spin-out companies and businesses from local community. We have some funding from Charnwood Borough Council to be able to do that, but just in that very narrow region, as Scott mentioned, that fragmentation. But I think finding that help and support is quite difficult for a lot of businesses, and it can so easily pass you by when you're busy with stuff, important stuff like exporting and importing and meeting your customers. And with the best will in the world, that innovation, it's important, but it's not urgent. It sits in your in tray. And I think one of the things that an advisor can do is just help you reprioritize the innovation and get moving on something that you know is important, but you've got payroll to meet on Friday and you've got to get some cash in.
Sounds like we could be arming some of our students better as they navigate this. Many of them are apprentices as well, so helping them understand this landscape actually as they develop in their careers would probably be very sensible in this. It's a bit of learning for us, I think.
Right. Thank you ever so much for that. Did anybody else have any questions, please? We've had a good run at that. Well, it only remains for me to thank our two speakers, Nick Gostick, Scott Knowles. Thank you very much for your time. I found it really interesting myself. As I say, as a non-technical person, it's always good to get an insight into that kind of thing. We'll be sharing, with the speaker's permission, we'll be sharing the slides with everybody, including those who booked and were unable to make it, unfortunately, today. And as I say, it only remains for me to thank the two speakers and to thank yourselves for your attendance today. Do keep an eye out for future IoT Inspire webinars coming up. We do intend to keep running these with a range of different speakers, both of interest to people from academia and also from the business world. And once again, thank you for your attendance today. Take care.
Thanks both.
Bye, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.